First of all, good evening to everyone. And I'm so happy to be here with so many of you. So in terms of human history, over one or a period of 1,000 or 2,000 years, much research has been conducted into and much experience accumulated in relation to the mind. So this research and this experience really formed part of a great civilization of the mind, or spiritual civilization. And then several hundred years ago, humans directed great effort to developing the material world, and in so doing created a great material civilization. Both of these civilizations, the civilization of the mind and the material civilization, were made or formed by humans. However, one rather regrettable thing is that for some people we only hold on to our current civilization, the material civilization, and forsake the civilization of the mind, whereas others cling to the previous civilization and don't accept the newer one, and a conflict is posited between the two. However, one positive thing is that in recent decades, scientific research has been conducted into many areas, and the results of this have been that many aspects of scientific research and Buddhist doctrines or Buddhist practice have come together and seem to be forming one path. So, for example, the research of physics into the microcosm has much in common with Buddhist perspectives, and in fact, the two would seem to be coming closer and closer to each other. So when, first of all, physics was able to physically perceive atoms through experimentation, then science and Buddhism started to become very close. And then after this development, Einstein's theory of relativity brought the two traditions even closer together. And then with the advent of quantum physics, quantum mechanics, the two became even closer still. And then sometime after this, the arrival of the development of string theory, even though this at this stage is a theoretical supposition, it hasn't been physically proven. Nevertheless, with string theory, Buddhism and science come even closer together still.
Tani maung baga lo simchita lo ngapchi tin nangla tani nangchu tang tani ngukumruk panika titola tele jang nyebo chakba machu chokhak shekayos.
And in the next 30 to 50 years, I would surmise that physics and Buddhism will continue to become even closer to each other.
Tani ngukumruk baga nane pena ngacho khadok tani karoda marola sokpa tani ngubogo thola mebandrawo tang tani ngacho nawa nala koya ga jade ngacho suso la baga nala tani shonwi remoza matokpa shilogla mepa tani mamboz denhangshi pati tani ngacho nangchu nala tani tongbanye ka tani shitongbanye te tongbanye la mambuyo tinani shitongbanye la tani hal leba ga tangni po chakayore.
So, for example, in physics, the discovery that colors we see in the external environment with our eyes and sounds that we perceive with our ears, that all of these are but images or perceptions produced in the mind. Having proven this, comes these findings, these conclusions are very, very close indeed to Buddhist notions of emptiness, particularly external emptiness, there being different divisions of emptiness.
Teni te tambores, teni nipa de kanrezena ngaso tarta teni wansi charke, teni yang lapa la jimjing mambo zushine, teni yang tifshone yang nachuta pe tak nipo rondus.
So that's one aspect of the relationship between science and Buddhism. The second aspect would be neuroscience and its research. This is something, an area in which Buddhism and science are coming closer together.
Teni te masa teni ngaso perna tarong jamba ngaso likum ga teni gidje jing te sola yang jimjukshine yang tifshone yang ngaso nachu shola yang pe nyepo chakandus.
And not only this research, but also research undertaken into the physical body, such as research into genes and so forth, is also producing results that bring scientific discovery and Buddhism very close together.
Teni te niparente, teni sambade ngaso pena teni gumgyamne teni lapala teni charungaranjin teni shine ngaso pena sim chipo jamba lipoda ngakta te su chichi margo sim chipo ngaso teni lapala teni girjumambo jaktapati charak baga tarta teni wansi charak baga shine te ngaso nangchu khabardo dorji thapa sanga dorji thapa nala songbate so tam pe tak nipo chakanda.
So that would be the second aspect, and then the third would be meditation. So through the research of neuroscientists into the brain and the discovery of neuroplasticity, basically showing that just through the effort of the mind by itself it is possible to influence and influence the brain. This knowledge or this discovery brings Buddhism, and particularly the Vajrayana tradition, very close to these scientific discoveries.
Teni perna teni te nibaris, teni sambaga thone shana perna Virginia ga teni the yang charipa mambo teni mi teni kiwang afshela teni jimjik dang mi chechok teni sangwala teni jimjik shine teni khoso teni charik teni tasar ka thone jimjik shine tanjang mambo teni khoso delen shin di thone teni mi teni kiwang afsheta chechok sangwa teso teni pe mambo teni the hago ina tarta zorjik teni charik pa tarta ti thola kelin sheo marita mena teni gantar teni charik thone jimjik shine mambo yong de tenga so nachuda haliba nipon rong de sambadres.
And in addition to this research that is being undertaken into past and future lives, particularly among scientists affiliated with the University of Virginia, research into past and future lives and the mysteries of human existence has produced a great deal of data on these phenomena. And it's through this research there is much that we can discover, even though these findings aren't perhaps accepted by mainstream science, there is still a lot of research, scientific research on these things that is currently being produced.
Tani tsara ka tani ta lorgi ka thola tani phergip shone tani tanjang tani todo tandang ka tani kocho softa ka tanjang yo piti tanjang te cho thamchi po nga chu nang chu na la tani jewe chini tani rond nga chu sama ka tani munjun she ga yo.
So, over the course of the development of science, data collected through scientific experiments, rigorous scientific experiments, is bringing science and its discoveries ever closer with to Buddhism. However, not all the content of the Buddhist tradition is able to be explained or verified by science as it currently stands. Buddhism and science have their own different scopes. They have their own respective areas or spheres of concern. Even though they might be different, however, there is still a great connection and close relationship between the two. So, for example, the Buddhist explanation or the Buddhist doctrine of interdependent arising in terms of cause and effect is a doctrine that is in accord with the natural sciences. The natural sciences that is not accepting the notion of an independent creator.
semkam yarje tanga ta teni sherb yarje tanga deso tabshi deso tamjipo ngune jane kayo layo ko teni jongdur shi ser teni je ma to ba ji la dong da da deso la nangchu ge yichi she ge mare.
So in the Buddhist tradition of meditation has very substantive, very effective methods of cultivating compassion, developing one's mind, developing one's wisdom. These are the primary concern or methods of the Buddhist tradition. In terms of current science, there aren't so many methods for developing or improving one's mind. In our everyday lives or in society at large or in the greater world, combining both science and Buddhism or Buddhist methods will give us great benefit. I started to pay attention to the relationship between Buddhism and science in the 1990s, and the reason for this was just this, the potential benefit that can be gained in combining them both. Thank you.
So we wanted to sound a few themes for the discussion today, and the first one is exactly what Khenpo has pointed to, which is an issue that came up in America around 2005, and this is the National Geographic cover piece on what is in your mind. So the question of the nature of the mind suddenly became a topic for mainstream American society. And so that is what I'd like Alyssa and Tad to address each.
Thank you. My research is in philosophy of mind, and I'm most interested in our common sense concepts about the mind, the assumptions we make unreflectively about the mind And I think I'm also very interested in Buddhism for a number of reasons. And one reason is that I think there are assumptions about the mind in the Buddhist tradition which appear at odds with assumptions about the mind that are very prevalent in the Western philosophical tradition. So one example is the kind of Cartesian model of the mind that comes from the French philosopher René Descartes in the 1600s. And René Descartes thought we could doubt things that are happening outside of our minds, but the one thing we couldn't doubt is what's happening inside our minds. We can't doubt, for example, that we have a self. We can't doubt what we're thinking when we're thinking it. This kind of self-knowledge is authoritative. And one thing I found interesting from the Buddhist texts that I've read, and again, I'm just beginning my journey in exploring this wonderful tradition, is that they have a more subtle and complicated understanding of the nature of the mind. It's not as transparent to itself, it seems to me, as it is in the Cartesian tradition. So, for example, although we might think we have a self, through meditation, through practice, we can discover that the self is a kind of illusion. And many of the other assumptions we make about the mind might, through practice, we might come to see as not the full truth about the mind. And this idea that we might not know might not be experts on what's going on in our own minds and how our minds work it's fairly recent in the West. With Nietzsche and Freud in the 19th century, and then in the 20th century, it became more popular. But it's certainly not the default position in Western philosophy. And still many philosophers believe that we have a kind of direct access to what's going on in our minds, and we can't be wrong about it. But I'm very interested in how ancient the Buddhist idea is that our understanding of our own minds is actually much more problematic and complex, and many of our ideas about the mind actually conceal the truth about the mind rather than revealing it. And it takes many years of practice to appreciate all the subtleties of the mind. So I guess what I want to ask Khenpo is if he could have some remarks about where he thinks the common sense concepts of the mind in the Western philosophical tradition, how they compare with the concepts of the mind that come out of the Buddhist philosophical tradition.
I'm a health psychologist, and I've been studying the different ways that the mind, our thoughts and emotions affect our bodies. So kind of started from a small model and have been just fascinated and enriched by understanding more of the of contemplative practices and how that can enhance our understanding of the mind and the mind-body connection. And so I don't even really use those words anymore, because I think one of the things a concept I want to bring up is that our mind, our thoughts are not located in our brain, and actually we all have an extended mind and an extended body. And so what that means is that we are influenced by everything, by both input from our body, and we know that from neuroscience about how emotions are made up. They're not just responses to stimuli in the environment. But the way that our cognition works is that it is shaped and it interacts with the setting around us, with interactions with people and things. And just to give you an example of that, I'm going to talk both about the body and then the mind. So in terms of the body, we have this sense that we have this physical body that's 100% us and human cells, and that we're not connected to others. And all of that's wrong. Some people, contemplative science and medicine knew that thousands of years ago, and some Western thinkers as well. And I like this quote by Lewis Thomas: "We are symbiotic creatures and interdependent on the rest of the world. Our cells are not ours. They're a mix of creatures." And we're getting to know that. We're getting to understand how our body is so complex and interdependent with small organisms and with the world around us. So, for example, We have 20 billion mitochondria in our bodies. That was started off as an independent organism that we became symbiotic with. We also have 100 trillion bacteria and fungi. We don't like to think about that, but this is an amazing discovery that we now understand. We have it inside of our gut and our body. We have it on the outside. These are not human cells that we're carrying around, but we're completely interdependent. If we were to kill our microbiome, we would be sick. Our immune system wouldn't work. We couldn't fight any infections. So we're actually completely co-evolved and adapted with all of these organisms. So just within our body, we are completely interdependent. And we might think of this as an ecosystem. And when we realize that, then that leads to this natural de-reification of the self as completely isolated and separate. So when we think about the mind, it's really distributed through this complex system of the mind-body and all of those little organisms, human or not, human cells or not. And then we are interacting with the social and physical environment. So has anyone here gone into a place of meditation, like a retreat center or a temple? Lots of you. I thought so. So that walking into that setting is just an example of the rich effect of the environment, the set and the setting, the context, and how that shapes our feelings, our nervous system, our emotions. So we're conditioned in that case to have certain thoughts and to become introspective and to become calmer and to develop metacognition, which we'll be talking about soon. So that's just an example of how much context matters. So besides so cognitive sciences really embrace this idea of embodied cognition, and with a little bit less attention to extended or embodied emotions. And so I'd like you to think about all the ways that our emotions are also connected to things outside of our body. They're not just generated in the brain in isolation. So we are influenced by people, dyads, even strangers. So smiling at a stranger actually changes their emotional state and their pro-social behaviors afterward. We're influenced by social networks, by what we see on the news or what we're reading on Facebook. All of those things influence our emotional tone. And research has shown that in different various ways. We also have, when we're under severe stress, we actually are changing our physiology. We're impairing our mitochondria. We're changing our microbiome. So we know all of these connections are now at play constantly. So within ourselves, we can see this mind-body connection, that they are really, it's not two separate things, and we just think above the head, and that doesn't influence the body. But there's another piece of this connectedness that we don't think about, and that is the transgenerational connectedness. So what we carry our life experiences with us, and particularly we know this with severe suffering, stress, and depression, we transmit some of that information to the next generation through our epigenome and through our telomeres, which I'll be talking about soon. So just as an example of how our emotions are contagious or co-regulated between us, I wanted to just point out one study by my colleague at UCSF, Wendy Mendez, where mothers, when they are stressed out by the experimenter and the baby enters the room, gets put on the mom's lap, the baby adopts the nervous system activity and the affect of the mom. So it wasn't a conscious transmission. And the same thing happens when the mom is just listening to relaxing music and her nervous system calms, her heart rate variability goes up. When the baby's placed on her lap, the baby adopts a calm affect. So emotions are between us, not just inside us. This is an example of a study on couples, romantic couples. And in this study, you can see that at baseline, the two couples have heart rate variability that's not so synced. But once they start interacting and they're in dialogue and they have eye contact, their nervous system becomes completely synchronized. So that heart rate variability pattern shows you that we're just a few seconds behind our partner in terms of responding to their own nervous system. So this is a mind-blowing finding that is now all over kind of social and psychology and social psychophysiology, that we have this co-regulation with each other. It's just fascinating. And this is actually even more strong if the couples are closer, if they're more a happier couple.
Tani tari gelaka travelanga to nurshuk tani sim ka tani munzun ta tani nga so nangchu sim ji munzun ka chabarwa tani na tani nurshuk tani ta ta ga tani pe na zoji ku sani rig ba yin na je tani chari na re tani chama ga yang na sim te la ba yin ba da yang na la ba ga tani shawa yin ba ka sim te tani la ba le shwa tani munzun she kan do se.
So Ted here asked a question about the relationship between the different understandings of the mind in Western science and in Buddhism. Well, to start with, the traditional view in Western philosophy or science is that the mind is the brain, or originates from the brain, or what the brain does. In any case, the idea is that the mind originates in the brain.
Tani tawa shatsrdela ngarang gerla tawasios, ngarang gerla samsarsios.
And I have my own particular viewpoint on this.
Me samna tit sarig shatsrde sarig tang tambazrem du samgos.
And in my view, this view, this supposedly scientific view, is actually not in accordance with scientific reasoning.
The Jimson Garazina Tsarik Goni, Shawakang, Tachu Shegona, Denhuang Shegona, Gabajab Gona, the Tanjang Gores.
The reason that I say this is that according in the scientific tradition, if one is going to establish something or prove a particular finding or refute a particular finding, one needs evidence in order to do this. Of course, there is a connection between our minds and our brains. This is something that clearly exists.
Labagani muni kega yorizina de danjang yo marzi de la toto danga danjang za tarti ba de shong yo marzi.
However, that our mind is something that originates from the brain is not something that we have irrefutable evidence in support of.
Tendi indi ngaso gangtar pe na ngaso labade teni ngaso semgo na la namtong ramda kiwi kapsu teni labade la teni ngstu mambo yongwa tang gerwa mambo labaga lolum la.
However, that when our minds give rise to all kinds of different thoughts, this has an effect or influence or a response in the brain. This is something that neuroscientists have shown.
Labadang ni the same gumdera wansi bagatini koso shio patila ndeshit japsra jamba yores.
However, this relationship between the thoughts of the mind or the mind and the brain is something they have a different explanation in respect of.
Ndeshit japsra jamba the kan rezina pena nato simte koram pena ti chig nala tin rovi chig tez chikala tin chig tez yar nipo kala Rovi Nyanja Bosris, the Nyas Chiganalan Rovi Caps, the Nyati Chimaris, Yanang, the Chigatola, in Yeran Rores, Chigatola, in Chigatola, or Yoa Yungoris.
And this different explanation is that it's rather like if we imagine a fish traveling beneath the surface of a body of water. Not at on the surface, but just slightly beneath the surface, the movement of the fish in the water would produce signs on the surface of the water, ripples and so forth. But these ripples are not the same thing as the fish itself.
돈돈 그 되니 단장당 담바 그 되니 레시츠 메나 되니 단장 되니 도도 단단 그 단장 메나 되니 가서 라발리 기바리제 안다오다 코랑 라바리제 안다오 티소 제탑고 말이스.
So without a evidence to support a view that the mind is that originates in the brain, then this conclusion or this explanation can't be proven.
근데 차르 그 돈이 도도 단단 그 단장요나 되니 미창마 켈랭 그래서.
However, if science or scientists were to produce solid evidence in respect of this idea or theory, then everybody would accept it.
나서 상마 켈랭 고 그래서.
All of us would have to accept it.
나서 그냥 로 카시니 켈랭 그래서.
With an open mind, we would all have to accept it.
예나 딘디즈나 따로 가서 대황 당금면 되고.
However, in respect of this, the data as it currently stands is insufficient.
셈 그나라 납토티나 라발라티니 게란로요 레타티니 파르킨 게라타 간딘로요 다롱 삼로 당고야스.
So that when that our brains respond to activity in our minds is something that we have now shown. However, the relationship between this activity in the mind and the response in the brain is something that we still need to.
간디즈 근데 페나 치당 냐건 데란다 보인다. 양나 되니 코랑 되니 페나 라바 코랑 셈영거 강인거 돈데 디니 파르건드라테 가서 다롱 삼로 당고야스.
So we need to still continue to give more thought to the relationship between the mind and the brain, the nature of the relationship, whether it is that between the fish and the ripples on the surface of the water or some other kind of relationship.
되니 직시나 되니 라발란 게란도와 그 디고텔라 치고 그냐타비 되니 셈 잠바즈 요레스 직시나.
So it's possible that the external or the movements or processes, the activities that are taking place in the brain, that beneath them there is a mind like a fish beneath the ripples on the surface of the water.
되니 낭추고이나 딘디기스 셈 코랑야 되니 웅부보즈 옌 되니 라바다니까 맞아 상가 노르지 타바나라 페사로셰요라 라바디 페나 코랑가 락찬라 보인 되니 페나 맞아 미츠가 되니 짐트라 되니 레갈레나 라바디 코랑 짐트라 보인 되니 모디 되니 셈디 페나 되니 짐트 페이션트 당가 문라 보인 되니 제그레스.
So in Buddhism, we regard the mind as a type of matter, and particularly this understanding is very clear in the Vajrayana tradition. That is, the brain is seen as a tool of the mind. We could liken it to a computer, and with the mind being the operator of the computer.
양나티니 베나가서 먹을 리포다 라바다 먹을 리포다 베나가서 되니 짐철 거더니 슈콕 프차한다 보시긴 되니 셈디 맞아 디난거 년치한다 보시긴 되니즈긴 제그레스.
Or we could also say that our external that our mind is like software that is inserted in the outer or the physical machine of our body.
되니 셈디라 맞아 름바 겟제요 름바 겟.
So in terms of the mind, we say that there are 8 different levels to it.
되니 맞아 물다 나와다 나다 지다 리 되니 맞아 지 쇼르 그 능고 탐주 냠슴 용화데 냠용 그 차딜라 셈제요.
So those our different sense faculties, our sight, our hearing, our sense of smell, our sense of touch, and so on, these together comprise those which are able to perceive and experience the sensory phenomenon, what we together regard as the mind.
되니 디토랑 가서더니 제 마리 약보리 드보리 삼바가 된디가 샤바망 보통야가 셈딜라 되니 이치시바세 그래 득바데레스.
And the 6th level is that which is able to evaluate this experience, analyze it.
Tani dambati ngaso namjin ngaso soag nala nga samba teris. Tari gigmorang ga dak zini shaka yo patenda po ngarang so nga dagin ngain samne tindi samdea ga ti namtote tani dambati res.
And the seventh level to the mind, or the seventh level to our consciousness, is the sense of self. Just as Tad just mentioned, this idea of self, this abiding sense of self, this is what we refer to as the seventh level.
Tani te ngaso shirtang ga mi parwa tindi yena ti namtote ngaso sem ga nala hal lipa ga tang zapores.
And this particular notion of the self, or idea of the self, is something in ordinary people which is very, very strong.
Tani pena ngarang ga zamazagayen, ngarang ga leka leyen, ngarang ga lojong shegen sambata so tsama ga nala nga zia ga namtote yores.
So, for example, the thoughts, I am eating, I am working, I am studying, in terms of all of these activities, the sense of I, or the notion of I, is very strong.
Tani gyapati kan rezina tani ngaso ga namto tsama ga tani mangjin rapote res.
The eighth level is like the foundation or the base for the rest of these other levels.
Tani pena ngaso ga namto te yamso ga lapta gore, kapkapsel lap halipa chimbo yung gore, kapkapsel lam chungchung gore, kapkaps chego tola rumo chungchung nirma chego nirma ma topa yomare. Gantar tani te so tamchin namto gore. Ina tani ngaso namto gyapa sim gyapati tani yamso ga chinda bore halipa tambore.
So our thoughts, the thoughts that we experience, are like waves. Sometimes there are very big waves, other times there are very small waves. Sometimes the waves are just like wrinkles on the water's surface. This eighth level of the mind, or the eighth level of consciousness, however, is like the ocean itself.
Tani ti namtokti koranga labalin depi tini shavaleka mambuz letap ko yores. Labali garwi. Labali depa zinata labagale mate pileka mambuz koranga letap kores namshiti.
And so this mind of ours is able to perform a lot of functions which transcend the brain.
Jikshina ngatso terang jiktin the kuzubares.
It's possible that this world that we have around us is made by it.
Tani indi tani ti tani koranga namtok ko tani nipate tani tarta tsar ka jimji ka kyap khong mambuz ka nala yungdu se ti namtok ko tani ti koranga nipate so sim ka nipate so shi yungdu se tarta.
So the power of the mind is something that is being increasingly paid attention to different areas of science. The power of the mind is something that is gradually being recognized.
Ngasu samna tani lo sumche ngapchi tindi gongla yana taron tele tezi tani rang chishina tele taron tezi yin rang gogori ti kamni tani ngasu tsar ka kyap khong ka nala tani namshi ga tani nguzin ti jechi sone ngasu tani rifshi gyawlak chikbarin do na shisar yonsar te shin tindi chikbari na chosar lo ngapchi tikchi jila.
It's possible, therefore, that within another 30 or 50 years, that the scientific understanding of the mind and the Buddhist understanding of the mind will meet, will become the same.
강타랑 같은 돌디바 사모 고네시아나 강리즈르지나 남시제야데 슈로 근직된데 탐주보 냠순용 탐큰거 든지가 니바 할리바가 드니 침보 든지 셈고 가서 리포나라 용큰 든지즈르제 그레스 돌드나.
However, summing it up very briefly, our mind is that which is able to experience and perceive phenomena that very strong, that has a very strong power or capacity to do so.
Yeah.
So Khenpo has provided us some interesting metaphors. We just had a study trip to Harvard, so he heard directly from neurologists and neurobiologists their point of view on what is the mind, and one in particular, a chair of a major department there at the Harvard Medical School, said, the brain is the mind. And I think he was quite taken aback. So what we wanted to do was to also introduce the idea that there is a diversity of thought in terms of even a scientific approach. There is not one scientific approach to thinking about the mind and brain. And so if we could speak to that.
Yes, well, thank you so much for those enlightening remarks. I'm besides being in the philosophy department, I'm also a co-founder and co-director of something called the Mind-Brain Institute here at George Washington University, which is a interdisciplinary center. And a lot of philosophers who study the mind these days think that you can't study it from just one perspective. Whether it's physical or not, that's a separate issue. But as far as studying the mind goes, you need many different perspectives. One of the most influential American philosophers, Willard Van Orman Quine, once had a funny saying about this. He said, "The universe is not the university." And what he meant by this was that the universe is complicated and it doesn't come divided up into neat chunks the way universities do. It's not that there's a part of the universe which is just for philosophers to study, another part of the universe just for neuroscientists, another part just for psychologists. The phenomena that we're interested in the universe are complicated and require many different perspectives. So that's the reasoning, not just behind the Mind-Brain Institute, which is where my interest lies, but it's a new philosophy for the whole university. One of the planks of George Washington University's new agenda is interdisciplinarity, for this very reason, that the universe is a messy, complicated place, and we can only make progress understanding it together by collaborating. So I think the kinds of concepts of the mind that I talked about earlier, that philosophers and ordinary people bring to their thinking, have an influence on science. And it's important to sort of know which of these concepts are good ideas, good frameworks from which science can address questions about the mind. Now, I need to, I guess, get a little clearer. It is true that in contemporary philosophy and science in the West, the default assumption by many is that the mind, in some sense, is the brain. The idea is they look at other examples from science, the history of science. So, for example, for many centuries, people didn't realize that water was H2O. They thought water was one thing, and H2O, who knows what, that people didn't even know what it was. And then they realized, actually, it was one and the same thing. Similarly, for many other discoveries, people didn't know what genes were, then they discovered it was DNA. So a lot of philosophers and scientists think, yeah, we haven't yet established that the mind is the brain, but one day we will establish the mind is the brain in the same way that water is H2O or genes are DNA. We didn't know it at first, but we will discover this. Now, this is actually not the traditional Western view. So if you go back to people like Plato and Descartes, their view was much more like Kempo's. They thought the brain and the mind were distinct. Plato and Descartes, in fact, thought the mind was not even physical. It wasn't a kind of matter. It was some kind of immaterial substance. Later philosophers thought that the mind perhaps is a kind of byproduct of the brain. So the brain does all the work. And the reason people think that is because if you take out pieces of the brain, you can't do things anymore. You get paralyzed, you lose your memory. Many of us maybe tragically know people with Alzheimer's. Damage to the brain leads to a loss of your mind, right? So that kind of evidence leads a lot of people to think that, well, the brain is doing all the work, so what's this mind? It's just a kind of byproduct. Just like when the car engine when the car engine makes the car drive, it gives off heat as a byproduct. The heat isn't doing any work. It's just a kind of byproduct. So that was a pretty popular theory of consciousness anyway in the last century. It's called epiphenomenalism, and there's still some philosophers who believe it. Then there's the mind-brain identity theory came along and thought the mind and the brain will be something like genes and DNA or water and H2O. But probably the most popular view now, and this is a view that Kempo alluded to, is the view that the brains are kind of like naturally evolved computers. Just as a bird is like a naturally evolved airplane. Now, flight is not the same thing as the bird, right? Flight is not the same thing as an airplane. Flight is what the bird does. Flight is what an airplane does. And by analogy, the thinking is that the mind is not a thing. It's an activity. It's what the brain does. Just as in a computer, there's the hardware, which is the thing, and then there's the software the computer's running, which just is a word for the activity the computer is engaged in. So probably the more popular scientific view of the mind right now is the mind is kind of like software. It's the activity that the brain engages in. So it's not exactly the same thing as the brain. It's kind of like the relationship between software and hardware in a computer. The computer makes it possible for the mind to run, but they're not exactly the same thing. In fact, there's a pretty famous computer scientist you may have heard of, Ray Kurzweil, who made a lot of money developing software in the 80s and 90s. And now he spends his whole time trying to be as healthy as possible. He's in his 70s or 80s. He's in a special diet, does special exercise, because he's convinced if he could just stay alive 20 more years, they will be able to upload his mind onto the internet. He's so convinced that the mind is software that he thinks computers will one day be able to run your mind and you will exist in a computer. So that's a kind of, I would say that's probably the most popular view, but I think, as Tashi pointed out, there's a lot of dispute in science about what exactly the mind is. One thing we need to keep in mind, though, is that there are many different components to the mind. So a lot of philosophers might say memory is part of the brain, language is part of the brain. So those parts of the mind are just parts of the brain. And the evidence for that is you can knock out people's memory by damaging a part of their brain. You can knock out people's ability to use language by damaging a part of their brain. That's the evidence. But then there are other parts of the mind, like subjective consciousness, what it feels like to smell a rose, right? The subjective experience you're having as you're chewing on a piece of chocolate. I can't experience what you're experiencing. I can have my own experience, but not your experience. That subjective side of consciousness, a lot of philosophers think can't be explained in terms of the brain. That's something other than the brain. Other philosophers disagree. So we have to be clear about which part of the mind we're talking about when we address the question of whether or not it's the same thing as the brain. The last thing I'll ask Kempo is, I found really interesting the idea that he says the mind is not the brain, but it is a kind of matter. Now, usually in Western philosophy, you either think the mind is not the brain because it's not matter, it's non-physical, it's like a ghost, okay? Or if you think the mind is the brain, you're just saying it's matter. Now, this is an interesting in-between view where you're saying it's not the brain, but it's still a kind of matter. But I find it a little confusing because I don't know where this matter is. If we open up your brain, we don't find your mind. We just find more brain. And so I wonder where this matter is. If the mind is a kind of matter that's moving the brain around, where is it? So anyway, that's where I'll end.
Nice. Should I go? Well, just building on, I love this. I think there's some agreement that brain is necessary for the mind to work, but it is necessary, not sufficient. It's a very important organ. If we think of the if we think of the brain as also a place that we store memories, for example, then I want to give you an example of how you are using your extended mind, and you're probably not aware of it. Does anyone rely on an external drive for their memory? Part of our mind is here, and we use that and incorporate that in our thinking. It's part of how we think, and we rely on it. So that's just an example of how objects can become part of our extended mind. I wanted to just go through an example of how we can understand this mind-body relationship and how it extends outside of our mind and body. And so building on this theme of interconnectedness, I've been studying marker of biological aging for the past decade, a bit more, And I'm going to tell you about them and what we can learn from them, because it's a fascinating insight into how we're affected at the most molecular level. So if you think about aging, we all have the same rate of aging through time, minutes and years, but biologically, we're on quite different clocks. So a 50-year-old could look 40 or 60. So what's that about? How can we understand that? Where is this clock, if there is a clock in the body? And of course, aging is complex, and there are many different ways that we age. But one important way that we know we can speed up our aging is by wearing out our telomeres. And so this is a picture here of a chromosome. It contains all of our precious genes that code for all of the proteins that build our whole body. And at the tips of these chromosomes, you see these orange packets of DNA. These are not genes.
There's a little light. You can the green light.
This is right here. You can see these are the telomeres, and they are non-coding. They're base pairs, just like made up of the same thing as the DNA, as the genes here, but they actually are very, very different. They protect the genome, and to do their job, they have to be very sensitive to the environment, the intracellular environment. So they're like a canary in the coal mine. When something is not quite right in our body, in our cells, the telomere picks that up. It's one of the first. It's damaged 8 times more easily by free radicals and oxidative stress than the genes. So it sends out help signals, and that cell either goes into an old age senescence state where it starts becoming pro-inflammatory and that causes aging, or it dies. So we want to keep our telomeres long so that the cells can go on and replicating and not go into either senescence or death. So what do we know about what causes telomeres to shorten? Lots of things: health behaviors, genetics. One enzyme that my colleague Liz Blackburn discovered is telomerase. So that blue glob is a big protein with some special properties that help it rebuild the telomere. So we have a kind of a yin-yang system between the two. And I should mention she did win the Nobel Prize for this discovery. And she started off in yeast, and now we know that there's, or actually in tetrahymenon, in a single-celled organism, the telomerase, when you turn it up, the cell becomes immortal, and it lives forever. And if you block that enzyme telomerase, the cell dies, because the telomeres chip away to be too short. So what about in us? It does look like in us, in humans, if our telomeres get too short, that's a very good predictor of getting diseases early in life. So besides the genetics and the health behaviors, something I've been very interested in is stress. Stress is potent. Stress has a big effect on our body, as smoking does in some studies. But not all stress is equal. What kind of stress is going to be causing a big physical response to be chipping away at our telomeres? Is it the lion or the gazelle running away from the lion? So clearly that gazelle is having a threat response and running for his survival. And when we take on that same type of bad stress, that threat stress, and we live that over and over, that is what we call toxic stress, and that is strong enough, we think, to impact our telomeres eventually. So besides stress and early trauma, we know that relationships can appear to be protective to telomeres, so more social support, longer telomeres. An interesting study showed that married couples tend to have telomeres that are correlated. So if they're if one partner has long telomeres, by old age this is, the other partner tends to as well. And now my favorite example of how our telomeres are affected by influences is the one outside of the body, and that is neighborhoods. So this is, let me tell you really briefly about a study in Hong Kong. They studied men who were of similar education and income, and some of the men were in Kowloon, very busy city, and some lived in the beautiful, peaceful New Territories. And the telomeres were significantly longer of the men who lived with all the greenery. And other studies have shown that neighborhoods, feeling safe, having an aesthetic neighborhood, these are things that are associated with longer telomeres. Even when we try to kind of control for and equalize all the effects of other things like our individual income. So if you think about what does that feel like to be in that poor neighborhood? How does that affect your heart rate variability and your thoughts and your interactions versus being in nature or a neighborhood that has a lot of green? So neighborhoods are turning out to be very important for shaping our nervous system and possibly even our cell aging. And lastly, my last point, which is the most dramatic, is that we're just starting to learn that distress, stress, dukkha, depression, something big that we can measure in pregnant women appears to be transmitted to the fetus. So when we measure the cord blood of the baby, as soon as it comes out of the mother, we find that mothers who've undergone severe stress during pregnancy have babies with shorter telomeres, right from day one. So that's an example that's telling us that we might be seeing some effects of our life experience transmitted to the next generation. So they're examples of biological embedding, how this affects our bodies and possibly are transmitted across the generations.
Thank you. Nangchu todenshana gato semzeate ani korang labada nikala halepa teni ndera chimbo yose gato labaga nala teni gato mukun thong mata pa teni tsa teni tsalm tena teni sumchisoni zo sumchisoni teni yang shirtang gato teni muk zigla tawa nawa teni dala nyamba teni tsa ngabja yose ne teni song yores gato dorji thamba nala.
So in Buddhism, particularly in the Vajrayana tradition, there is a very close connection posited between the mind and the brain. So in the Vajrayana tradition, there is considered to be 32 main nerve channels in the body that come together in the brain. And in addition to these, 500 further nerve channels that relate to our various sense faculties.
통윙우보다 맘통윙우보 니가 접아서래 되니 통윙우보데라 되니 야샤 ang나마도요 말이 맘통윙우보데 야샤 급주 고나레스.
So these nerve channels that are posited in the Vajrayana tradition are not ones that we are able to perceive with our naked eyes. And indeed, in terms of our material world, that which we are able to perceive with our eyes only constitutes 5% of the total matter. That which we are not able to see, that which is invisible to us, in fact constitutes 95%. And so similar to this, our human bodies are constituted by matter or material of both visible and invisible kinds. So in terms of these different kinds of matter, visible matter and invisible matter, they both have different kinds of functions. In terms of the matter that we are able to see, this is something that science is increasingly recognizing and researching.
So in It's true that if we were to have some injury to our brain or to lose some part of our brain, that this would have a negative influence on our minds, that this would influence our mind. So we might say that it's rather like a pen that writes words.
So it's like a pen that is drawing a picture. The pen is not the person. However, without the pen, the person would not be able to draw a picture.
근데 라바가 나니 차시스 메바시잖아. 셈 것들이 니바 냠죠 그래서. 제때 때 냠르비 김선때 라바 코랑 되니때 셈인다. 배나 녀거당 먹은 데란다 보인 다른 되니 샤바 잡고 그래서.
So we know that if we were to take away a part of the brain, that the certain functions of the mind would be negatively impacted. However, whether this is because the relationship between the mind and the brain is that between the pen and the person, this is something that we still need to give more thought and research to.
되니 다르다가 되니 왕시 차르 바가 배나 라바당 되니 라바 나라 되니 카시스 메나 미 되니 셈금그니 바카시 냠저고요. 제때 되니 김제와도 배나 뭐당 녀거다 버 마리즈니 제고나 데제탑고요 마리즈 왕시 차르 바가 땡아서 되니 왕시 차르 바 초고 되니 녀거 되니 배나 뭐가 되니 녀거 되니 리모트나 되니 녀거 메나 미트탑고 마리즈 이나 되니 왕시 차르 배나 가서 왕사가 가서 라바가 나니 되니 니바카시스 냠소나 되니 가서 셈그 니바 냠저 그래 제때 디디니 냠르비 짐슨디 제르바티 되니까 라바당 셈근 제르바티 배나 뭐당 녀거 바르금 제반다고 마리즈니 제고나 왕시 차르 바 따타제탑고요 마리즈.
So we know that if the brain, a part of the brain were taken away, that this would have a negative impact on the mind. However, contemporary neuroscientists are not able yet to say that, or to say based on this, they are not yet able to refute the possibility of the relationship between the mind and the brain being that between the pen and the person drawing the picture.
대식이더니 다가 가서 셈디더니 강락니 어디서나 시당 가서 셈디더니 또 나추고 나니 시나 우보레지 그래지 옛날 가서 나추고 나니 우보 운전실 대당 가서 납쇼건 산이를 빠더니 나추고 대 산이를 빠 우보 운전실에 대해서 만들어버렸어.
So in terms of the mind, in Buddhism we do understand the mind as being a kind of matter. However, in terms of the Buddhist understanding of matter, this understanding is somewhat different to the way that Western philosophy understands matter.
드닝아 좀 산이를 바나 파치는 무본들이라고 때라 무보세요 그래서 이나 나추고 나라 때 말에 나추고 나라에나 빼나 드니 무보 잠발라 녀와 땅터야 무보 잠발라 드니 샤바시 틈큰 딘지근 니바 참말라 드니 무보세요 그래서.
So the way that philosophy understands matter is probably something like this table here, whereas the way that Buddhism understands matter is that which is able to effect change on something else, that which has some kind of agentative capacity or agentative force.
드니 빼나가 저 로지가 나라 로지나 거도와 로지 로지가 거도와 어야 로지가 나라 로요바 진드제 로지가 나라 로요비 네급나 드니 로때 드니 로지가 나 참마라 참네요 그래서
네 연주 손을 줘.
로지나고
电子器是吧？
电池
那是。
呀。
对연주. 뒤차상 연주 손을 줘.
드니 로지가 나나 카버가 로지가 나라 로속나 로때 드니 로지가 나라 로지가 드니 로요사 때나라 참마 참네요 그래서 참네요 그래서 뭐야.
So when, for example, a battery in a phone has power, then this power is dispersed throughout the entire device. So a human's live body is like a battery. And our mind is like the power. So,
셈 그때님 제가 치슈 뭐마데 라바다 되니 냥라데라요.
So the mind has the greatest connection with the brain and a lesser connection with the nyungla deni trewa dele chungwa yo.
다 냥라데라 되지요. 조 라발란데라요.
So the greatest connection is with the mind is with the brain. It does have some connection with the heart, but relative, not as much.
근데 배나가 저 강집란데 디시님 좀 특나 초라지 용거래지. 근데 디값은 아주 심디 늘라 통요래. 나 초라 딘디 용건득 삼데 건냠뉴 용거래지.
So, for example, if we were to tickle the bottom of our feet, then we would experience a feeling of being tickled, and our mind would go to the bottom of our feet.
되니 뭐니 되니 짝지니는 됐나? 되니 차 그래지. 되니 아주 심디 될라리벼래. 나 차은득 삼 그래지.
And if we were to pull on a few hairs on the top of our head, then our minds would go to this point and register that, ouch, my hair is being pulled.
시당 ndso nga chu nyamnyung le labores yena nga tenim chani rubada ndso nyokta chimbo shiyana teni gergung ge shasong teni nga chu chizya de shitang le labores yena ndi rangshin karere teni sha teni chama hamako az chakare.
So, in fact, these are really easy or straightforward aspects of experience that we all know. However, science makes a real muddle of these things, makes them extremely complicated. So, just as Ted said before, something like water, the nature of water, this is something that should be relatively straightforward, but something that, in fact, was something that we made extremely complex.
Yeah.
Well, we will have an opportunity to have Khenpo give a longer exposition about the nature of mind tomorrow, 1 o'clock, along with the Mind Brain Institute. We'll be hosting Khenpo to do a full seminar just on this topic. For now, we're going to shift gears to sound our third theme, which we would like to have Khenpo also comment on, which is the fact that there has been a mainstreaming of all of these practices into the global culture, global modernity, and we would like to talk that out a bit.
Okay, so yeah, part of the reason I got interested in Buddhism is because I started meditating and it really improved my life, I thought. So I started thinking philosophically about what it is that's going on when you meditate. And I was introduced to meditation through secular Buddhists. The person that I first read was a man named Stephen Batchelor, who's a promoter of secular Buddhism. And so I was thinking about it from a secular perspective. And to me, I think one way of understanding what's going on when you meditate or when you're mindful is you're practicing a kind of metacognitive skill. So metacognition in psychology and philosophy means thinking about your own thoughts or thinking about your own mind or thinking about emotions. And one sort of secular way of understanding about what's happening in meditation is you're just training yourself to become better at metacognition, better at manipulating your own mental states. Now, human beings are metacognitive virtuosos compared to the rest of the animal kingdom. Other animals, there is evidence that they engage in some forms of metacognition, but not nearly as much as human beings do. Human beings are really do it all the time. And really, if you think about it, much of our success depends on metacognition. One reason is that in order to function in society, we have to turn ourselves into a certain kind of person. We have to come up with a public self. And a lot of that involves thinking about our thoughts, controlling our emotions. You know, there's an evolutionary psychologist named Susan Hurdy who gives this example. Imagine if you put a bunch of chimpanzees on a transatlantic flight, and she's that don't know each other, and then they land, and she says guaranteed all of them would be missing fingers at least, right? But humans routinely interact with strangers, people they don't know very well, and in completely civil ways. So we're very good at controlling emotions and so forth, and these are metacognitive functions. But the thing is, there are better and worse ways of doing this. And particularly in the complex modern world, we find we have to maintain very different faces to very different audiences, right? And this, I think, is a source of a lot of dukkha, to use a term from Buddhism. It's the source of a lot of anxiety and stress. And I think you can conceive from a secular perspective mindfulness as a way of becoming much better at this sort of stuff, much better in metacognitive skill. So I think there is a big advantage to having a secular understanding of what's going on. And even from the Buddhist perspective, right? If you're a Buddhist, you should care about, you should be compassionate, and you should care about the suffering of others. And if you care about the suffering of a lot of mainstream Westerners, then the only way to reach them is through some kind of secular version of mindfulness. So there is that advantage, but there's also a disadvantage to the secularization of mindfulness. And I think part of the disadvantage is we in the West often tend to think of things like mindfulness as a kind of gimmick, a thing, not a gimmick, but a one-time intervention. You know, I'm feeling bad, I got to take a pill. Oh, well, maybe I won't take a pill. Maybe I'll meditate and I'll fix what's wrong with me, and then I'll move on with my life. I won't need it anymore. And that kind of approach, I think, is really undermines what's so powerful about the Buddhist tradition in training metacognition, because really it's about changing your whole life, your whole lifestyle, the way you approach others, the way you eat, the way you drink, the way you talk, right? There's the Eightfold Path involves right speech, right action, right thought. So it's a holistic lifestyle change that mindfulness is a part of. And I think one danger from the secularization of mindfulness is that you forget about this and you think of it as this isolated intervention to cure a particular symptom, right? And I think that's a misunderstanding of the power of it. So although there are advantages to this secular understanding of mindfulness that I began with, there are also these disadvantages. And I'm not sure you know, how to resolve the issue.
So I work in a hospital, UCSF, and I can tell you that because mindfulness can be secularized, it has pervaded all of our well-being interventions, our clinical psychology interventions for depression, anxiety, PTSD. We now have mindfulness versions of our different therapies. And it's very, very exciting because they reach people in a way that our other therapies don't. And so there is, on one hand, I'm going to talk about stress reduction for a minute and just say we know that chronic stress can be unbridled, and if not managed, it can go on and on for years and have negative effects and suffering, and really just decrease the quality of life. How do we change that? So there's never going to be one size fits all because we are all so different. And for some people, they may get into different flow states from different activities. So there may be hobbies or exercise or ways that they are actually clamping down on their own stress response, and that's fabulous. There are many, many paths. But mindfulness is actually, mindfulness training is in a category of its own, it seems, because of this metacognitive ability. So so the gift is that you are awakening to the idea that you can control your attention, you can observe your thoughts and feelings, and so you can actually not just live through them as if they are your moment-to-moment reality, but to observe them and control and choose where you place your attention. So when we bring people who are suffering and have never experienced anything like meditation, so I'm thinking about like the caregivers that we work with. Every day they wake up and they start to think about what is ahead of them. And so they turn on that threat response, that gazelle response. When they're trained in this mindfulness, all of a sudden it can be liberating, that they can be awakened and live a life with more control and choice. So we do see a lot of transformation with even small doses of mindfulness. And then there is, of course, the serious contemplative training, which is really in a category of its own, which is different goals and outcomes and a different path of regular practice and really training the mind. And that's unrealistic for many of us depending on our degrees of freedom and our lifestyle, et cetera. But it's beautiful that we have the option and the whole range, and that mindfulness has pervaded our culture and it is acceptable. And of course, there are some problems with the dissemination, like using it for profit. But overall, I think when people get the awareness of what mindfulness is and the values that go with it, of being more compassionate, then I think we are on a wonderful path. And it looks like it's everywhere, and we're just at the beginning of this permutation of our society, I think.
Tani champagner jak gumzena nyang ji gumzena ja tani te acho nabshogla te halepa tani ta tani lobja na la energy tani mamba na la energy tasu mambuz na la pe tarchip tani chimbon rogun te na mi chama ga tani acho chuluk jabjong mepa shini tani te nyamlin shege yensen tani zege yaje yimbatini nangchu na ne re te na nangchu tini ta korang malak nangchu na la korang malak cha chang wa zre ina nga chu shu na la ti tarta peshu chwa na la peshu tangwi ne kemna malak jamba ti so thamche bom margo wa shi tina ni chig len ne tini nga chu peshu tang de ti jina mi samala phanto yong gre pe yak bori sang de.
So whether it be mindfulness meditation or compassion meditation, currently, particularly in the West, these kinds of meditation are becoming very popular in schools, among doctors and so forth. And everyone is talking about this being a kind of meditation without religious baggage, or a secular kind of meditation. So in general, Buddhist meditation practice is part of a complete or comprehensive system of practice. And so mindfulness meditation is really like taking an aspect or a part of this complete and comprehensive session. However, even though this is the case, selecting one aspect of a greater total package, the fact that this is bringing benefit to others is something I regard as positive.
tani korang malak chasang na ni jambati so nge keleng men ngarang tabayang me ngarang goyang go me yena tini tambanyir jak chipoti go nyarji chipoti ngarang go te ngarang pe shotang yen zina te chokore te korang pe na nachula taba me namba ga tini chupas yemba ke malin na korang te nyalin shina ndukris.
So if someone, for example, isn't willing to accept all aspects of the total system of Buddhist practice, they don't have Buddhist faith, they don't feel themselves as needing all aspects of the total Buddhist system of practice, and they simply wish to select or choose from this greater package, say compassion practice or mindfulness practice, this is something that I see as okay, I see this is fine.
Tani kangtaro nangchu wanda shina koranga tini gumda ndasu tsangmate simjin la tini pamba ka shirda tini khotsu tini zubare te yena tini kangtar simjin la pasona semgana la dugmur mepa tini la pansona tini rikuyore te korang jamba kelena chokore malina chokore.
The methods of meditation in Buddhism were primarily developed for the purposes of benefiting others. So that they are able to do this is very good. It's not if people are willing to accept one aspect and are not willing to accept other aspects, that's quite fine.
Teni gazo tangrab ka teni mi semkham la teni nguni tane pan thoya deyang zo nangchu nane teni shamnyang jeta tani tari champagner jogzena jirne gum teni pesho tana teni pa mi changma pesho tang thavya mi changma teni laglin tana lang thavya mi changma la pan thoya teni zris.
So among the Buddhist meditation practices, compassion practice and mindfulness practice, or shamatha meditation practice, is very beneficial to the psychological state of contemporary people. So these methods are being spread, they're being implemented, they're being practiced, this is something that is good.
있나요? 다른 낭추 고니시나 되니 곰잡아치 보고 연구만 다른 때 배나 낭추고 나니 카시즈 렌니 수속고나라 배쇼 땅나 데레자야 보여 사례세.
However, from a Buddhist point of view, not everything can be addressed from meditation, just through meditation. So combining other aspects of, or taking other aspects of the Buddhist tradition and implementing them in society would also be very beneficial. For example, taking or appropriating certain Buddhist values and spreading and developing these in society.
pena nga tso tini sem ga nala dungur yong ne kamna gum jam ni dungur me pa chik bo lan dang jem ni tele jam pa machina tani nga tso dungur kum jongkhung ti ka re jena shisong de re nga tso sem ga nala tini dungur mo bo yong ya te nga tso shisok dan soan di na ne yong go yore tini indi shisok dan soa ti la gerju ma jem na tani nga tso tini dungur kum jongkhung ti la gerju jap tab go yo ma re.
If we don't do this, and rather when we experience suffering, we meditate in order to address our own experience of suffering, we're not addressing the root of that suffering for the reason that the various pain and suffering that we experience actually originates in society. So if we don't make changes, social changes, then we're not really addressing the root causes of this suffering.
Pena nga tso zama ga tini chotin ya bo machine nga tso poa nana tani poa nawini kamna nga tso man thonggo gresi tes chigresi tele jan nga tso zama ga thola tani nga tso yang chotin ga thola zabzab chi go ndu ma tok ba tani yang chotin ga thola zabzab ma china yang nga tso poa na gresi.
So it's the same as when we eat food that is unclean and we get an upset stomach as a result. In the immediate situation, we need to take medicine to address the symptoms. However, just taking medicine by itself is not a way of addressing the problem of unclean food. We also need to pay attention to the hygiene conditions of our food.
Zamala Zambrazua, Nika Shipajinda, Jining to Tambanya Gumjagata, Nini Natsutini, Shusokotini, Rentangatawa, Tats Gerjujavia, the Nika Shonsona, the Nichatsanga Borindo Service.
So, just as we might address the upset stomach by taking medicine and by making changes to the hygiene of our food, so too by practicing mindfulness meditation and at the same time making changes to social values, by combining these approaches together, we can have good results.
Yinayang penangatso de nanchu nane tambanye chaka gomda nyang jedang teni yang te maim biren thangatawa khashile ne ngatso pesho tana te jamgi ngatso nangba rendo mare ngatso nangba shida ma shi so rangla te ranga thakcho na chokore te tapa ma shi na chokore counter te so pesho tana te yakbo yong sares.
So by practicing mindfulness meditation or compassion meditation and appropriating certain Buddhist values in society, simply doing these things doesn't make one a Buddhist, or doing these things doesn't automatically make one a Buddhist. Whether or not one wants to become a Buddhist or not is something that one can decide for oneself.
I'll just mention that this time cover is from 2014, which is the year that's been announced as the Year of Mindfulness. So we're talking about a very recent sort of breakthrough into mainstream consciousness, I think different from the first wave of interest in meditation and especially mindfulness, which was more religious and it's about spiritual seeking in the 1960s. And the second wave, which was really about the stress management kind of mindfulness, John Kabat-Zinn and the MBSR method. This last, the recent wave of mindfulness, what's different about it is that it's really connected to peak performance. So we see it at places like Davos, and we're seeing, the Marines meditating, for example, a whole program of meditation for the Marines. So how to be the best warrior you can be, and so forth. So this is a really new phenomenon. And if I could just add that Alyssa's book is coming out on what she's just introduced very quickly, but it's fascinating research, and it's coming out in January in 20 languages at once. I hope you caught, all spouses in the audience, I hope you caught the bit about the covariance of the lengthening of the telomeres. So if you're, for spouses who meditate and take up a lot of space and time in your lives together, you also benefit from that person meditating. So I think we can take some questions now, sometime. I think she was the first one, yes?
I wanted to ask about what was once tossed aside as any sort of legitimate scientific theory, and that was, I think it was Lamarck, the inheritance of certain traits over generations. Isn't there now some rethinking of this, and how does what you were saying about certainly the newborns acquiring or being severely influenced by the mother's state of being, how does this relate to acquiring certain predispositions, virtuosity?
That's a good question, and what I was referring to was actually not genetics transmission or change in genes, but actually epigenetic transmission. So what that means is that any shorter telomeres from mom to baby was happening through changes that were environmental. Well, let me explain this better. So if the mom has short telomeres from her stressful life or any other reason, and regardless of her genes, she can transmit those short telomeres through this germline, the egg, to the baby. And so that is a direct epigenetic-like transmission. And the other ways that we transmit genes without changing the genes is through turning genes on and off, the methylation patterns. And so when we think of epigenetics, we usually think of the methylation patterns on genes and how those are transmitted to the baby. So certain genes might be turned on or off. But the telomere transmission is more of a newer idea or phenomena that we're seeing. So one example of that, we know that when a parent with a genetic disorder and has short telomeres because of the genetic disorder, let's say they have two children. I'll tell you about a true case. One child gets the genes and has short telomeres. The other child is very lucky they don't inherit the poor telomerase genes. So there's no reason they should have short telomeres genetically, but they still inherit very short telomeres, and they still develop an early aging syndrome, a mild one. And that is because it's a direct transmission from short telomeres in one of the parents' gametes to the offspring. That's not about the genetics. It's just about the material being passed on, being shorter. And another pathway might just be the direct stress effect, regardless of the parents' telomeres. The stress in the womb and the cortisol might also be impacting the baby's telomeres. So it's complex.
Thank you. Try to ask my question clearly. I was listening, and I heard Sem in Tibetan a number of times. But when you talked about the 32 and the 500, I'm wondering if that's also the winds or lung, or are you using Sem and lung similarly?
Yeah. The
So these, the 32 and the 500 are channels.
For the winds or for the mind, or the winds and the mind the same?
디 베나가서 라바나라 드니 심치소니 드리 고르시 드리 요레스 라바나라 드리 요레스 드리 요나 드니 가서 드니 셈고 드니 셈드니 드니 디 자딘 콜로 디나라 드리 따나 드니 룽 디나라 조레스 데 따타 왕시 창르 반담 그냥 드니 고온도세 가서 셈 그나라 요아 티비네 금나 드니 라바나라 디라 착지 그요레 대 원치 자르바 된 통화되다니 간다 본다 본도스.
So these 32 channels come together at the crown of the head, and through the activity of the mind, the wind can travel along these channels. And so this is similar to the way that neuroscientists now talk about the way the mind can affect activity in the brain. This is a very similar kind of explanation.
되니 싸대서 있는 가서 남긴 거 가서 소화하나라 대서 배셨던 거요 말이지.
The chisadi namchukizade.
어, 라방는 거 싸대서 남긴 가서 소화하나라 배셨던 거요 말이지.
And these channels in the brain that the spoken about in the Buddhist tradition are not ones that are used in our everyday lives.
되니 딘나라 되니 가서 리포고 착되라 되니 착 닉마다 착 당마제 되니 요르스.
착 뇽마다 좀.
닉마다 당마.
So in terms of the blood in our body, we can talk about two kinds: blood that is turbid and blood that is pure.
되니 거기서 곰그 니발라 되니 착대 당마다 닉마 소소가 얘가 시그레스.
Through the power of meditation, the turbid blood is separated from the pure.
되니 당마디 디 싸디 준당라 땅거레스.
And the pure blood is pushed into the, or is manipulated through the channels.
되니 디나라 되니 데 싸디 준나라 착당디 되니 니바 무서와 가서 남긴 샤와신 마타바 되니 그더니 샤와만 보시 탑거레스. 셈고 돌아 니바 되니 뭐 용거레스.
And with this pure blood flowing through the channels, it is possible for us to, or the mind to, achieve or perform tasks out of the ordinary realm of what we are usually able to perform.
되니 데 라발라 게추잡저티 되니 라바데 가서 셈고 그런 거 락차레스. 되니 라발라 게추잡저티 되니 셈티 라발라 되니 샤와 몽볼리 탑거레스.
So because the brain is a tool of the mind, if we're able to make changes to the brain, then the mind is able to use the brain to do a number of extraordinary things.
되니 대ペ나가 좀 나마더니 얘기했잖아. 되니 녀거 얘기했죠. 그래서 니마치라 mam부터 탑거 말했어. 다르다가 주더니 찜출 거더니 얘기 잡 그랬더니 니마치라 mam부 살 그래. 베텐다 버렸어.
So we can liken this to the way that previously we had to write everything by hand. And as a result of this, we weren't able to write many words in the span of one day. But now that we have computers to type with, we're able to type a lot of words. And so this is a comparable metaphor.
Campbell, I have a question for you too. We've heard about different uses of meditation for stress, for peak performance, for spirituality. And you've talked about this ability of the mind to do new things. I'm curious, your Chinese students, what are they seeking? Why do they come to you? And what do you give them? And finally, what have you learned in this trip to America that will be new information you can assimilate and pass on as part of your teachings?
Yeah. 되는 가서 야미그나라 낭추 냠내신 그 추방 고마디 요르데 디수이나 양코서 셈그 등을 메바시야 한다고 든지그 돈달 데 말에 가서 셈그 나는 녀무바 참마 메바시야다. 조데 수소란 거 시험당 양지다. 더니 시르 야지 동야 돈다그래 때 가서 야미 옛날에 보바 옛날에 너쇼콤 옛날에 남바가 소망고 마티소 지바레스.
So in terms of real students of the Dharma in China, their goals in studying Buddhism are not simply to alleviate pressure or suffering in their minds. Their goals are to increase and enhance their compassion and wisdom, and these are common goals of Buddhist practitioners everywhere.
드니데 마임 방아서 베나 디 롭자가 나자다 드니 총바가 드니 진 소바요 총바가 총바 드니 켈레바 대초 나랑아서 드니 롭주시가 우리 디카비나 양아서 나주샤고 말이요 셈거 드니 등거만 메바시 시비셔도 드니 넙속라 가서 롭자가 나다 니만큼 거 나란다고 다 직발해 놓으세요.
So aside from these, from practitioners of the Dharma in China, when we teach in schools and among associations of business people and entrepreneurs, etc., what we are not teaching, we're not teaching these for these Buddhist goals. Primarily, what we're talking about is reducing and eliminating suffering and stress in the mind, and
내가 좀 눕쇼 다 직발해. 눕쇼 나 배나 잠반 일 장다 영지 금리 등을 매 파셔 다 직발해.
And so this is the same as it is in the West in terms of the goals of mindfulness practice in schools and in other institutions.
tani daringa dawas chik tang tani lak zuri tani nanang dawas chik tang lak yin tin nangla tani ngarang ti America shak ta नुभ쇼 ko nangla tani wansi changrik pa tani gomla tani jimji shin kan tani mamboz chasung tani khocho tani jimji kun rew di 땡에 빼나더니 메잠발라 tani 파르샤나 tani lochung choy나 khocho gomla ichiwa raoda tesola pe pando yosari samgeos.
So over on this trip, I've spent slightly over a month in America visiting the East and West coasts, and last year I also spent about a month on a similar tour. And over this time, I've had the opportunity to meet with many neuroscientists researching the relationship between meditation and the brain. And I think that in going back and sharing this knowledge, particularly with young people, it will have benefit in terms of their conviction in meditation.
내가 저 낭추 있나 그런 것들이 다 검점나 되니 판바 요바데 하고 요랬다 옛날 때 소소 냠뇽 마도 받더니 단정 드디어 말했어.
So in terms of Buddhists, they have experiential knowledge of the benefits of meditation. However, they don't have hard data to support these benefits.
되니 먹하실라 그런 거금 잡이 냠뇽데 마톰 비공도 되니 가서 금 잡는들이 판도요 그래서니 디짐지 그 단정 됐었더니 파르샤나 그런 저 금라 무바요 한다고 대 판도요 사리.
So before a practitioner has gained direct experiential knowledge of the benefits of meditation, sharing with them the data that has been collected on the benefits of meditation will be of benefit to them in terms of their desire and interest in continuing with their meditation practice.
Thank you so much for your interesting and thoughtful presentation. What can ordinary people do to increase their longevity, to lengthen the telomeres in terms of behavior, decision-making, and exposure to beneficial stress? Thank you.
You've got it. I love your answer. Good stress, engagement in life, challenging yourself in ways that are exciting and cause growth, and promoting your social connections and compassion for others. So helping people is what feels good and creates meaning in life. Learning from Kenpo, I think that what our research has shown is that there are many different ways to improve your telomere stability, and it depends on kind of looking at your life and the different things that are affecting it. So for some people it may be stress, that's a common one. And so some of the big ticket items that will promote the telomerase and increase it would be exercise, a diet high in omega-3s and whole foods, seaweed. I personally like to promote the algae and not the fish, because we're farming too many fish. They should not be. I'm up for fish rights too, so I think we are. So other areas, so getting enough sleep is an important one, and having at least, social connections. We don't all need big social networks, but having a confidant, having some good quality relationships is really important. And in terms of stress reduction, we don't just want to think of stress reduction and getting to baseline, but really living more fully and purposefully. And so we like to think of health span, not lifespan, but really that we want to make our days count. We are going to, telomeres predict early disease. They're not a great predictor of how long we live. There's so many things that can extend life these days. So what they really predict is health, how many years of healthy, good life we have. And that's what we want to focus on. You can take more questions, but I actually need to run to the airport. But this has been incredible to hear. Thank you so much.
Actually, we're going to, I think, thank you so much, Alyssa. We're going to close the discussion here, and we're going to be, for those of you who can stay, we'll have a reception upstairs at the Art Gallery. So sorry if I know there are more questions, but we can talk and continue. I just want to say that when we created the title for this evening, we wanted to put quotations around every single word because we want to destabilize the idea that there is an East and West, that there's one version of consciousness, one version of contemplative traditions. That's the whole point. I think that we're aiming towards describing a shared culture, and we're also trying to participate in creating that shared global culture. And especially thank you for both Alyssa, who made a heroic effort to come today, and Tad, who's been splendid since we're cracking all new ideas about what we can do here at GW, but especially for Kempo, who has not only brought his wisdom and insight, but has brought himself. And this is not a very easy thing to do. I just want to say that he has taken a leap of faith in being here, and he will take all of this conversation because he is just an extraordinarily prolific thinker, writer, lecturer, immediately assimilates information. He's considered the most brilliant scholar that has been produced through his institution in his tradition. And we're so grateful that he has taken this leap of faith and that he'll grow the shared culture as he travels back to China. So, thank you.
Thank you.